Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to this week's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing, and really appreciate you guys making some time out of your day to watch the video. Always very grateful for that. I know these advanced bass fishing videos are a little bit longer, so it takes a little bit more of a commitment to watch them. So thanks to everybody that's been doing that. Guys, got a really good, really info-packed seminar for you guys today. We're going to be talking about the pre-spawn period of bass fishing that we're getting ready to come up on. At the time of filming of this video, it's pretty much first week of February, or last week of January, first week of February, sort of like the early beginning of the pre-spawn phase. And we're going to go deep into this. What I'm going to do in today's video, we're going to I want to give you guys sort of an overview or an introduction in exactly what the pre-spawn period is and what the fish do during the pre-spawn period and some of their moods and behaviors. I'm going to get into that in the first part of the video. Then I'm going to show you some of my favorite lures and techniques for fishing during the pre-spawn. And then the last part of the video, we'll talk a little bit about, the type of areas that you need to specifically target based upon the lake that you're fishing. So there's gonna be a lot here. Also guys, before we get started here, you guys know every week I like to do a little housekeeping before I start into the video. Just wanted to invite everybody to please subscribe to Advanced Bass Fishing. Much appreciated if you hit that subscribe button. And also guys, one of the best, if you like the content here, you get something out of the seminars, the best way that you can show that appreciation or thanks or whatever is to use my Tackle Warehouse links that I put in the description. I'll have all the baits I talk about. And if you use and bookmark that Tackle Warehouse link, the channel gets a small percentage of the commission of any sales. So that's a good way to help out. And if you're not familiar with where that's at, is the title of the video. Right underneath the video title, you'll see a little thing that says more, and you can push that, click on that more button for the video description and the link. So much appreciated there. Okay guys, pre-spawn period, man. Right off the bat, I'll tell you, the pre-spawn period is without a doubt my favorite time of year to fish. There's more big fish shallow than you're ever going to catch of the whole year. And when I'm talking about shallow, I don't mean like in super, super shallow water. I'm talking about in water less than 10 foot deep. There's a larger population of 4-pound plus fish in less than 10 foot of water during the pre-spawn than there will be any other time of the year. And on top of that, those fish that are up there, they're more aggressive than they're going to be at any other time of the year. They're the whole biological cycle of the fish as far as preparing for the spawn, and the waters get a little bit warmer, daylight hours are getting a bit longer. The bigger fish are simply more active and aggressive and willing to bite during the pre-spawn. That's why the vast majority of the big fish that are caught every year are during the pre-spawn period. It is the best time of year to fish by far with that. So I've always really liked this time of year because after February, March, and April, it seems like those bigger fish get harder to catch in a lot of different lakes out there. Now, when you're talking about the pre-spawn, I want to dig into this exactly what it is here before we get into the lures and everything. The pre-spawn period, actually you have 3 different periods within the one pre-spawn period. You've got the early pre-spawn, you've got the mid pre-spawn, and then you have the late pre-spawn season. Now, all of these are determined by several different factors. Obviously, water temperature has a big influence in that. The second to that would be the daylight hours getting a little bit longer, because over that course of the pre-spawn period of the year, which is pretty much from February to May, based upon what part of the country you're in, that's the time of year when that happens out there. So those 3 different phases out there are, again, marked by water temperature, longer daylight hours, and sort of like the internal cycle of a bass. It's almost like when a Canadian goose, how in the world does a Canadian goose know how to fly to Canada down to the southern border and find their way back? It's a instinctual, intrinsic, just natural intelligence that they have. And it's the same way with the fish as far as, feeding up, preparing for that spawning cycle that's coming up there. So given that, the period of each pre-spawn phase, early, mid, and late, there's several different, ways that you approach it, several different things that the fish do. The early pre-spawn is sort of marked, I consider it the early pre-spawn starting in February. And even if your water temperatures have not begun to warm up yet, say you may have some of your lakes still frozen over or whatever, but regardless of the water temperature, those daylight hours every single day are getting longer. And with those increased daylight hours, you start to have a movement within the fish. So one of the sort of the unexplainable things about bass fishing is, like, say for example, in January, you can have 45-degree water temperature and those fish may be deeper or deeper suspended. And then you may still have 45-degree water temperature like the first week of February, like we do here in Missouri. But regardless of what that water temperature is, those increasing daylight hours and the closer proximity to the spawn that the fish are getting ready for on a biological level, that gets those fish moving, and it starts them moving shallower and it starts repositioning them. So one of the first things that you'll notice is when February rolls around and you start initially maybe getting just a slight warm up in the water temperature. Say for example, you gain like a degree every 2 weeks or something like that, or 1 or 2 degrees every 2 weeks in the water temperature. That is a big deal when you add that in correlation with the longer daylight hours. So what this does on that is it starts to move those fish that are scattered out all over the lake, the fish that are offshore suspended, the fish that may be out super, super deep because there's no thermocline, and a lot of those fish may be holding on the bottom in 30, 40, 50 feet of water, depending upon your water clarity. All of those fish that were using a diversity of water columns in the middle of the winter, they start making a slow transition and a slow migration a little bit shallower. Now, this is something that comes at a very slow pace, and all fish don't do the same thing at the same time. That's one of the things that you have to realize about bass fishing, guys, is when you're talking about techniques and patterns and movements, realize that all the fish never do the same thing at the same time. You're talking about what the majority or the majority of the fish would be doing. So say, for example, we're getting into February and I'm talking about some of these fish are starting to move up a little bit shallower. Maybe we're talking about 50, 60, 70% of the fish in the lake that are starting to make that move. Then you're still going to have 30, 40, sometimes 50% of the fish that are still holding back on that. And that's the same as you get all the way through the pre-spawn period. So but the thing about that is you want to focus on where most of the fish are. So that's what we're going to try to do in today's video. So anyway, once this starts to take place, you may have 40, 50, 60% of the fish, whatever, they're starting to swim out of those deeper water areas and they're starting to move into areas what are called staging areas. A lot of people, if you guys are, skilled anglers, you know exactly what I'm talking about with the staging areas. But if you're not familiar with it, a staging area is part of the route or the travel that a fish makes in preparation to getting ready to spawn. Doesn't matter if it's a male bass or a female bass. And a lot of times those fish will start moving into these areas that are closer to spawning areas early in the pre-spawn, but not in those spawning areas. So say, for example, if you've got a really good cove that you've seen fish spawn in before, maybe it's flat, got some nice gravel in the back of it, a staging area would be a type of structure on that lake that has proximity to deep water that is a little bit more vertical, that is close by to that area. Now these fish, what they'll do is and I'll get into that more as far as the exact structures in the end of it, but as far as, the exact areas to look for. But what I wanted to cover in this is what those fish do when they first move up into those staging areas. They'll just sort of hang around there. I mean, they don't really move much. They'll position on one particular area and they're going to stay there until the water temperature, starts to get close to 60 degrees to where those fish are wanting to spawn at. And in the meantime, they're just not inactive. They're feeding. They're feeding on gizzard shad, threadfin shad, crawdads, perch, whatever they can get. They're actively feeding, but they're not in those spawning areas out there. So that's one of the first things they do. Now, the second phase of that is when the water temperature starts climbing up to pretty much about say 5 to 10 degrees above its coolest point. So say, for example, here in Missouri, if we have water temperature that bottoms out in 40 degrees, now this is all relative to where you're at in the country, because some of you guys down south, you don't have that big of fluctuation, but in most lakes, like right now, let's say for your water temperatures is 40 degrees at its coldest point in January. When that water temperature starts to get like 44, 45, 46, 47, that's going to be the first phase, the early phase of the pre-spawn. The second phase that we'll get into is when that water temperature starts to get, say, 10 degrees above its coldest point. So saying here in Missouri, the water temperature it's 50 degrees, 48 to 50 degrees. Now this can happen quickly or slowly based upon weather patterns that come through. Weather patterns are not the same as climate. Weather patterns, when you're talking about pre-spawn, can vary season to season. You may have an abnormal warm spell or an abnormal cold spell that either shoots that water temperature up or keeps the water temperature down. It changes every year with that. But in terms of when you think it's going to be the second phase of the pre-spawn, it's normally like when that water temperature is 8 to 10 degrees above its coldest point. So the mid pre-spawn for me in Missouri here is going to be 48 to 50 degrees. Now, once those fish get into that 48 to 50 degree water, they're still going to be using the same type of structures, but their bait selection is going to be different. And we'll get into that here in a little bit different. Their mood and their personality have changed. And with that mood and that personality change also comes a technique approach change as far as how you need to fish for those fish we'll get into. And then finally, guys, the late part of the pre-spawn is that period right before the fish start bedding. This is probably one of the best times of year to fish, because this is when the most biggest active fish are shallow than any time of the year. And feeding, it's not those fish, there may be more fish actually spawning up there that are bigger, but those fish are maybe harder to catch. Those late pre-spawn fish are going to be your best chance to catch fish. And normally this is when that water temperature is anywhere between the low 50s to around 60 degrees. 52 to 60. When that water temperature starts to hit 55, 57, 58 degrees, there's a big change in the mood and the personality of the fish and how you want to fish for them. And once they start getting into that, mid to upper 50 range, that's when you start having those fish are on the move a little bit. They're actually starting to move out of those staging areas, and they're actually starting to move into those spawning areas. Now, they may not be up there in that shallow water to actually spawn, but say, for example, if you've got a good spawning cove where there's some gravel in the back of it, and those fish normally, maybe they spawn around a log or a stump in 3 foot of water in the back, those fish are starting to make a move maybe into that spawning cove, but they're holding out deeper, maybe in like 10 to 15 foot of water, out off a deeper part of the cove, out towards the mouth of the cove, getting ready to move back in there when that water hits 60s or the low 60s with that. That's sort of the progression that you have with that. Now, a lot of different variables involved with that. Like I said, as far as the timing on it, it can be the lake level. I mean, the lake level during the springtime of the year can fluctuate a lot if you get heavy rains or not. Again, weather patterns have a critical factor on it. A lot of different scenarios working together there, but that's sort of an overview of, what happens during the pre-spawn. So we're going to take a quick break, guys, and then we're going to get back and we're going to go over some of my favorite lures and approaches to use on these things. And then after we do that, we'll get into the, specific areas that you want to target with that. So we'll be right back. Okay, guys, we're back. Now we're going to get into the lures that you want to use during the pre-spawn. And also, I was thinking about it, and I think I'm going to do the lures in correlation with the areas at the same time. I think that'll make a little bit more sense to you than splitting it up, lures and then type of areas. So we're going to break it up like that. And also, one of the things that I think is really, really critical for everybody to understand is that when I'm talking about like these areas that I'm going to describe to you what the pre-spawn fish really like to get into, that does not encompass every fish that's in the lake. It's like one of the things that is really, really important to remember in bass fishing is that bass are where you find them. Remember that, guys. Bass are where you find them. And what I mean by that is they don't read books, they don't watch videos. I can give you a foundation on where the bass normally are at and normally live and where the larger percentage of fish live. But ultimately, every day is different, every lake is different, every season is different, every year changes. And you have to keep an open mind to expand on something. If what I'm talking about or what any other video you guys listen to tells you about, you need to use that as like a foundational building block. And if it's working great, you can duplicate it. But if it's not, try to expand out and experiment. And that's another thing that you'll find, the more that our lakes get more and more fishing pressure, a lot of the more obvious type areas are not going to be as productive. So you really have to use your creativity and ingenuity. Now, also, guys, the techniques that I'm talking about are non-live scope techniques. If you're a live scoper, what I'm talking about here is not going to be any use to you guys out there. I mean, we're fishing. I'm telling you guys how to fish for 50% or 60% of the fish in the lake that I like to fish for. If you're a scoper, there's 30 or 40 or 50% of the fish out in the lake that are just roamers that you're going to catch them out there on swim baits and whatever during the pre-spawn. But I'm going to get into the more diversity techniques with traditional fishing means here. Okay, before I get into this, I want to divide it up into, I want to address every part of the country here. And then I'm going to focus on what the majority of the country has. Because in the lakes in the country, it's like if you fish down south in a grass lake, Sam Rayburn, Florida lakes, TVA lakes, something like that, the pre-spawn is going to be completely different as far as how you approach it than it would be if you fish Lake Cumberland in Kentucky or Ozarks Lakes or Clear Lake in California or whatever. And it's going to be different if you fish Lake Champlain or the Great Lakes. So I'm gonna throw a bone out there to you guys up north and down south here before I get into the meat of it, which is sort of the mid part of the country. Let's talk a little bit about down south in grass lakes out there. The pre-spawn period when you're fishing down south in a warmer climate with grass on it, those fish do not do anything like the pre-spawn fish do up, further north out there. The natural bodies of water that have grass in them and are located in more of a southerly climate, you simply don't have the seasonal variations in water temperatures and weather patterns out there. And also, one of the things you're going to find out if you're in a grass lake is grass fish live shallower than any other type of lake out there. If you guys fish, Lake Guntersville or Lake Toho in Florida, those fish are going to live a lot shallower than they do here at Table Rock Lake or Bull Shoals where I live at. So that's another thing to consider. But you still have the same pre-spawn phase. The pre-spawn phase on a grass lake down south is a lot shorter and it's a lot different as far as how those fish bite and how they relate to it. Now, specifically, what I want to talk about is fishing grass during the pre-spawn. Type of areas that you need to look for and techniques out there. Offshore grass that have some type of proximity to deeper water, whether it be a creek channel or a main river channel, is critical. So in other words, if you're fishing out on Lake Guntersville or something like that, and you're fishing some of those bigger grass flats off the main river, you're always going to have some better success if you've got a flat that has some ditches running through it or has a little bit deeper grass or has some proximity to the main river channel. That's going to be the areas that those bigger fish use. But those fish don't necessarily live right on those drops. So say, for example, you have a big flat on Lake Guntersville and you got a nice little ditch running through the middle of that flat. Just because there's a ditch there does not mean those fish are going to be using that ditch or the edge of that ditch. They relate to that ditch and they may be, 50, 100 yards away from that, but they can still relate to that. It's more about the water depth on the flat and it's more about the depth of the grass, because based upon, again, your water levels and the water temperatures and all that type of stuff, one year you may have grass coming this far off the bottom and the next year it may be 3 times that high based upon those variables. So that's a determination. The best pre-spawn areas on a grass lake are going to be your deepest grass beds that you can find that has some type of consistency as far as the grass growing off the bottom, at least a foot. I prefer 1 to 3 foot of grass growth off the bottom mixed in with some of the deepest water in the lake that supports grass. That's where your bigger fish are going to be. And as far as the technique, guys, on a grass lake during the pre-spawn, it's hard to beat the lipless crankbait. Lipless crankbait like this Megabass Vibration X in 1/2 ounce or 3/4 ounce size is one of the leading lures and always has been when you're fishing grass out there. Now, one piece of advice I can give you with fishing that lipless crankbait and with quite a few of the other ones I'm talking about is during the pre-spawn, you're going to catch a lot more fish by pumping and reeling. So say, for example, you throw that lipless crankbait out there, you start reeling it till it hits the grass. And once you feel that grass, just pull it up like that and then start reeling it, pull it up like that, and let it fall back down. And I catch a lot more really big fish by sort of pumping, keeping that bait close to the grass than I do with just a straight retrieve over the top of the grass. That's a really good way to do it. Another outstanding bait for that is a chatterbait in the pre-spawn. Chatterbait is going to work a little bit better in the later phases of the pre-spawn. The lipless crankbait, it'll work in the coldest water. It's good all through the pre-spawn, but the chatterbait, probably my favorite bait for fishing over grass in the later pre-spawn. And normally it's the same way, guys. I fish the chatterbait the same way. Just cast it out there, let it go to, I usually let it go to the bottom, and then I'll rip it off the bottom like that to get it out of the grass. And then I just start slow cranking and just pumping it like that. Again, for whatever reason during the pre-spawn, that slow pump and retrieve on the chatterbait will work a lot better. And another thing for chatterbait fishing during the pre-spawn, I do like some type of a green pumpkin set up there. I don't really use shad during the pre-spawn much. Definitely catch more on the green pumpkin. Another really good grass bait, guys, out there. Probably if you gave me one grass bait to use over everything else, it's going to be a jerkbait. Megabass Vision 110. I probably caught more and bigger bass on a jerkbait over grass than I have any other lure out there. A jerkbait is going to be really good over grass during the pre-spawn on the tougher fishing conditions. If you have those days out there where the wind's not blowing much and it's a little bit brighter, there's something about a jerkbait that will generate those strikes under those conditions, you know, even better than a chatterbait or a lipless crankbait out there. The jerkbait's going to work all through the pre-spawn. The cool thing about a jerkbait over grass is you can get it in a lot of different depths and you can control that depth really good with it. But I've caught tons of good ones on there. And then finally, my favorite lure for fishing the pre-spawn and grass later in the pre-spawn, as far as for the biggest fish that I can catch, is a big spinnerbait. Big 3/4 ounce or 1 ounce spinnerbait with a number 6 or 7 willow leaf blade. Same way, guys, same technique. It's a slow pump. Throw that spinnerbait out there, let it hit the bottom, rip it off the bottom, just keep it in contact with that grass and pump it. But I probably caught more 7-pound class fish on a big 1 ounce spinnerbait in grass during the pre-spawn than about any other lure out there. So that's a little bit on the grass lake pre-spawn. Up north, guys, it's completely different out there because when you're dealing with smallmouth, you got a lot of diversity up north as far as what those fish use. Some of the lakes have grass, some of them just have big rock flats, rock shoals. During the pre-spawn, if you have a smallmouth heavy impoundment like Lake St. Clair or the Great Lakes out there, you're gonna do, nothing can compete with a jerkbait for pre-spawn smallmouth. It's like that is the deal out there. Jerkbait, just getting out on those bigger, deeper flats out there, covering water. You don't really have to fish close to any breaks or anything like that. I usually just like to get out there and anywhere between, say, 7 to 12 foot of water and just cover water with that jerkbait on those flats out there. That's been really good. Okay, now let's get into the meat and potatoes. Man-made reservoirs, what to look for here. A lot of the baits are the same, actually. You're gonna be fishing them in different type of areas. So I'm gonna go through, again, what the lures I use in the different phases of the pre-spawn, and then we'll talk a little bit about where to fish it. Now, first one, guys, my favorite, without a doubt, just like I said, again, it's the jerkbait. Jerkbait is my #1 early pre-spawn lure. I don't think you can beat it. Now, there's a case to be made, like an Alabama rig or, you know, a swim bait can work under some of those conditions, yeah. But day in and day out, it's just gonna be next to impossible to beat a jerkbait. And one of my favorite ways to catch them on pre-spawn and jerkbait, there's 2 different structures. One are main lake and secondary points, and two are the channel banks like we're talking about here with the jerkbait. A lot of this has to do, again, with your water clarity, but most of the time for the jerkbait, I need to have like 3 foot clarity. So if you have a lake that has over 3 foot of visibility, those main lake and secondary points are going to be really productive, as well as those steeper channel banks in the creeks here. Now, the main lake points on a jerkbait are going to be better on your lakes that have a mixed species of bass. So if you have a lake like, say, for example, Lake Cumberland in Kentucky that has smallmouth, spotted bass, and largemouth, in the pre-spawn, you're going to do a lot better on the main lake points with that jerkbait. Now, if you have a lake that does not have as many spotted bass and smallmouth and a mix on there, if you have predominantly, say, a largemouth with maybe just a few spotted bass in it, sometimes those secondary points are going to be better. The secondary points that are like in the major creek arms. If you told me in the early pre-spawn, Randy, you can only do one thing, and one bait, one fish one way, I would go into the major creeks and I would fish secondary points with the jerkbait. That'd be my #1 thing. And again, the channel banks are the same thing. In those major creek arms, get on those steep banks, make long casts parallel to those steep banks, anywhere between 3 to 10 foot of water, and just cover the water in those type of areas. But jerkbait's going to be really, really good under those conditions. The next one, guys, which is going to be, it's going to be good all through the pre-spawn, but the early and mid pre-spawn is going to be strongest. Excuse me. Is a crawdad crankbait like a Wiggle Warrior. This is a standby during the pre-spawn period on any type of lake that's got over 2 foot of visibility. You simply can't beat it, guys. One of my favorite ways to do it is just get on any rocky bank, any steep rocky bank in the lake that I'm fishing. It could be the damn riprap, it could be a bluff, it could be a steep rocky bank or whatever, but just cranking rocks with that. It's easy to do. It's very simple. Just get out there, get on those steeper rocky banks, put the thing on 8 to 10 pound line. I'll usually put some type of suspend strip on my crawdad crankbait and just slow crank it on those rocks. You know, slow crank it where it's just bouncing off those rocks and coming down like that. It's a really, really good way to catch them in the early pre-spawn there. Now, as it warms up into the mid part of the pre-spawn, again, the areas are very similar. It's just the bait changes a little bit. In the mid part of the pre-spawn, when you're talking about water temperatures right around that 50-degree mark, guys, this is when I go to a jig. Some type of a brown jig too. Brown and orange, brown, orange, and blue with a green pumpkin trailer. A brown and orange jig in the mid part of the pre-spawn. It's just a great bait to catch fish on, guys. There's something about that color combination during that mid part of the pre-spawn when that water temperature is around 50. You're going to catch as many or more big ones on a full-size jig setup than anywhere. And when I'm doing that, what I'm looking for that time of year is just shallow targets in those pre-spawn type areas. If there's boat docks on a steep bank, I'll flip a boat dock. If there's a laydown tree, like on a channel bank, I'll flip a laydown tree. If it's a bare rock bank, like a bluff bank, I'll just pitch the bare rocks on there. Stumps, whatever, shallow grass. Just fish shallow targets in less than 5 foot of water with that jig. Just a great way to catch them, especially on days where you don't have as much wind and you got a little bit brighter conditions out there. Say if you got a sunny, partly cloudy day, water temperature is 50 degrees, water visibility is anywhere between, 1.5 to 5 foot out there. Put your jig on there, get you around some rock and wood, and that's going to be a really good way to catch them. Now, another good bait, another one we're still going to mix up here a little bit, is slow rolling that big spinner bait during the mid part of the pre-spawn. Is going to be hard to beat, guys. Same type of deal. You got to have steeper banks. So the slow rolled spinner bait, it would be on a steep rock bank, a riprap bank, a bluff bank, or something like that. I'll give you guys a prime example of how good a big spinner bait works in the pre-spawn. I was fishing a Bassmaster tournament at Lake Eufaula in Alabama, and I had never been to, this was quite a few years ago, I'd never been there before, and there wasn't a lot of rock in Lake Eufaula. And I was really used to fishing rock back home with spinner baits in the pre-spawn, so the only rock that I could find was on the riprap bank. So I started taking a big 3/4 ounce spinner bait, and I was slow rolling it down those riprap banks down into like 10 or 15 foot of water. And the first day of the tournament, I had over 20 pounds. It was windy. Second day of the tournament, I had over 20 pounds. I was in second place going into the last day of the tournament. And the last day of the tournament, it completely bluebirded off, lost my wind, and they didn't bite it as well. But anyway, slow rolling that spinner bait during the pre-spawn down there is a good way to catch some big ones with that. Other things can work just as good. The chatterbait can work good during the pre-spawn, the mid part of the pre-spawn. Same with the wigglework crawdad crankbait. Now, as you get into the later pre-spawn, when we're talking about water temperatures, mid to upper 50s, right around 60 degrees, again, that changes the bait techniques and the areas a little bit. Now, as that water temperature starts creeping up into the mid to upper 50s, I'm starting to move shallower. I'm not fishing as many points. I'm not fishing as many steep banks or channel banks. I'm going back into those spawning coves. Now, I may not be like back where those fish are eventually going to spawn, but let's say, for example, you pull back into a cove and most of the fish are going to be spawning like 2/3 of the way back in there, say in April. I'll start fishing those banks leading into those spawning areas, and sometimes I'll move out a little bit deeper. And again, it's hard to beat a jig, guys. Just casting the jig out into that 5 to 10 foot of water is a really good way to catch them. If the water's really clear, a shaky head can be really, really good. Like put like a Zoom trick worm on an 1/8 ounce shaky head and just cast like 5 to 10 foot deep off those spawning type banks leading in there. Can be a really, really good way to catch them. And then also, guys, if those areas have rocks leading into the back of it, any type of a rocky bank or gravelly bank, once that water temperature starts to get in the upper 50s, one of my favorite ways is cranking a big square bill. They're like this Megabass 2.0 square bill crankbait. A square bill crankbait does not get the notoriety that it rightly deserves for being a good pre-spawn bait. But guys, a big square bill, I don't care if it's a balsa or whatever, is a great way to catch pre-spawn fish if you have shallow rock and a little bit more off-colored water. So the techniques we were talking about, like with the jerk bait and that type of stuff, a little bit cleaner water. But if you happen to have a lake that has a little bit more off-colored water in it, like your water visibilities are less than 2 feet, and you've got water temperatures in their upper 50s, and you've got rock, guys, put you on a bright colored square bill, like this chartreuse side blackback, something like that. Just throw it out there with the medium slow stop and go retrieve. And if you get a day out there that is nasty, let's say for example, you're out there, it's mid to late March, the water temperature is 57 degrees, and you got a cloudy sky, and it's windy, like the wind's blowing 10 or 15 miles an hour. Guys, you put you a square bill on and cover water on rocks, and you will get some good bites on there. It's all about the weather. It's like if you don't have the wind and the clouds, you're not going to catch as many. You'll catch some, but you're not going to catch as many. But on nasty conditions, you just can't beat that. And finally, guys, one of my favorite late pre-spawn baits, and this is going to be, again, a little bit different conditions. For this particular thing to work, you need a little bit flatter banks. You need some off-colored water. Is a big black buzzbait, like this Megabass Jamaican boa. Fish real slow right across the surface, guys. If that water temperature is 55 to 60 degrees, and you have a couple days where it starts to warm up and that water surface temperature starts to warm up, you put you a big black buzzbait on, and you can catch some of the biggest fish of the year on it. Just turn it, just reel it fast enough, just where those blades will stay above the water, like bloop, 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 and those fish will just come up and just suck it in that shallow water. There's something about a buzzbait that in shallow off-colored water in the pre-spawn, if there's any big ones there, those big ones will come up and get that. And again, you have to have sort of the right day. You got to have a average or above average normal temperature day. It really helps if you got some overcast. It helps if you don't have much wind, fairly calm, low light conditions, a little bit warmer. Guys, it is just, man, I've just had some great trips, under those conditions with that. But anyway, guys, that's a little bit shorter seminar today. That's my basic approach to the pre-spawn out there. It's going to be different on every lake that you fish. If you guys fish like Lake Norman in North Carolina, it's going to be different than it is in Grand Lake in Oklahoma. Every single lake is going to be a little bit different. But I think if you apply some of these techniques and, you know, into the areas that I'm talking about here, it's going to add up to some success for you guys in almost any body of water that you fish. So anyway, guys, appreciate y'all tuning in this week to the seminar. Like I said, really grateful for you guys watching the videos, and we'll be back next week. See you.